Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Thank you so much for braving COVID and this extraordinary heat to be here. I'm so impressed that I've got members of the audience to talk to, because it's pretty hot out there. I actually arrived, and the only thing that I could think of doing was I needed to jump in the water. I say the sea because I'm from England, so I needed to jump. So I've been for a swim in the bay today, which probably some of you will. Never thought that was possible, but it is. You can go opposite the Maritime Museum, you can go for a swim, and it's very refreshing. So I thoroughly recommend it tomorrow for those of you that overheat. So, but anyway, it's a thrill to be here at the Commonwealth Club, and it's great to be speaking here in San Francisco, because last time I was here, I was down in Silicon Valley. So it's fantastic to be in this fabulous building to talk to you about my new book, Bitch, which is about how female animals have been marginalized and misunderstood by the scientific patriarchy. And I'll kick off with a flavor of the kind of marginalized behavior that I'm talking about with my tutor from Oxford, Richard Dawkins. There he is, not looking in the slightest bit intimidating. He was a very terrifying man to write an essay for, I can tell you. But he was obviously the author of The Selfish Gene, and The Selfish Gene had this to say about females, that the female is exploited, and the fundamental evolutionary basis for the exploitation is the fact that eggs are larger than sperms. Female exploitation begins here. It's a pretty depressing statement to receive as an egg-making student of evolution. But, you can't blame Dawkins for this sentiment, because it goes further back, all the way to my scientific hero, this guy, Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin was an incredible scientist, and his theory of evolution by natural selection is one of the greatest theories of all in the whole of science. But he was also a man of his time. And so when he came to define the sexes, he branded the female of the species in the shape of a Victorian housewife, because that was what was appropriate for the time. And because Darwin said it, all the scientists that followed in his wake suffered from a chronic case of confirmation bias, and just either ignored things that didn't fit in with the paradigm that he'd set up, or they just didn't study females at all. He outlined his idea of the sexes in his second great theoretical masterpiece, which was published in 1871, which was The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And he said that the males of almost all animals have stronger passions than the females. Hence it is the males that fight together and sedulously display their charms before the females. The female, on the other hand, with the rarest of exceptions, is less eager than the male. She generally requires to be courted. She is coy. Now, try telling a female spotted hyena that she needs to be coy and submissive, and she'll laugh in your face after she's bitten it off. We now know that females are just as competitive, aggressive, dominant, promiscuous, dynamic, and varied as males. It's just for centuries we either weren't looking or didn't want to see it. But thankfully, things are starting to change, and in the last few decades, a revolution has been brewing, which is redefining not just the female of the species, but the very forces that shape evolution. And today, I'm going to introduce you to some of the females that are part of that revolution. And we'll start with the lioness. This photo I took, in fact, on the Tanzanian safari that I was privileged to be a part of, the Commonwealth, earlier in the year. And the lioness is really special to me because it was the first inkling that I had that females didn't behave in the way that I'd been taught at university. They weren't submissive, coy, and chaste, as Darwin had outlined. And it was about 15 years ago, and I was in the Serengeti, and I was making a series for the BBC about animal communication, and we were basically trying to have a conversation with a lion, which is actually not that difficult. So all you need is a loudspeaker with a lion's roar. We had a recording of a lion's roar, and I was with this Dr. Seifert, who is a German expert in lion communication, and we played the sound of a lion's roar out of the side, out of a little portable speaker, and. First of all, the sound of a lion's roar is nothing like the MGM sound that you're familiar with. It's like this sort of, it's not a kind of majestic roar. It actually sounds more like a sort of a kind of almost as if Boris Johnson was looking for cheese at midnight. That kind of sound. It doesn't sound like the sound of a lion's roar. So the whole thing seemed completely crazy to me. There was this sort of sound, and I thought coming out of a loudspeaker, I was like, well, this is never going to work. But it did. And sure enough, we played our sound, and then in the distance, and then got closer, and we play our roar, and then we played audio ping pong with this lion for about 5 minutes, until out of the gloom padded not one but 3 lions, 2 males and a female. And the males, as soon as they came across nothing, they didn't find anything that looked or smelt like a male lion, they just disappeared. But the female lion, she pinned us to the spot and lay in front of the Jeep, sort of legs akimbo, and wouldn't move for 2 hours. We were stuck there, and I said to Dr. Seifert, what's going on? And he goes, she wants to mate with us. And I was like, yeah, but isn't she like mating with one of those males that she was with? And he's like, oh yeah, but the female lioness, she's amazingly promiscuous. She'll mate over 100 times in a matter of days with multiple males during estrus. And I was like, whoa, that wasn't what I was taught. That's news to me. So I was sort of, quietly thrilled and curious about this incredibly licentious nature of the lioness. Well, we now know why the lioness behaves in such a promiscuous way, thanks to this woman, Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, who I think might be listening online. So Sarah is really a trailblazer in sort of challenging these stereotypes, and she's the first person to sort of to look at this conundrum of female sexual strategy. And here's a photo of her that was taken by her husband actually when she was studying langurs in India in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, and Sarah discovered she was studying at Harvard, and she went into the field to study langurs to find out about infanticide, because the males are infanticidal and they sometimes kill females' babies. But what she also noticed was that the females were very actively soliciting sex from males outside of the group, and really she was the first scientist to sort of not ignore this behavior that didn't fit the paradigm, but to go, well, this is interesting. Why is this happening? And she figured out that it was actually connected with infanticide. So, she worked out that basically the males are infanticidal because if a new male comes into a territory, then the females, if they've got babies already and they're breastfeeding, they're nursing the babies, then they're not going to be receptive to having babies with this new male. But if they kill the babies, then she'll be forced into estrus and she'll be receptive, right? So if the females have this counter strategy by mating with all the males in the area, then that prevents them killing the babies, because the males all they have to remember is if they've recently had sex with a female, then not to kill the babies. So this theory has now been applied to over 50 species, including lions. It's the same story with lions. It's basically the females are mating with multiple males to protect their offspring. They're being good mums, and in some cases they have an awful lot of sex in order to protect their offspring. We know that in an ovulating chimp female might solicit sex with every male in her community and have sex 30 to 50 times a day. Yeah, I know it sounds positively exhausting, doesn't it? I mean, and Barbary macaque females are equally lustful, with one female recorded having sex at least once every 17 minutes with every sexually mature male in the group, of which there were 11. So, what's really interesting is in human society, females would be given all sorts of bad names for such behavior. But as Sarah says, these females are just being assiduously maternal. They're actually, they're being good mums, and that's why they're behaving in that way. So obviously when I came to start researching this book, Sarah was top of my list of people that I wanted to get in touch with. And I wrote to her. She actually lives here in California. And she very generously responded and said, yeah, come visit me on I've got a walnut farm, and you can come and visit me at the farm. And I was kind of nervous because, talk by Richard Dawkins, who's a scary character. and here was a woman who's got an equal canon of work with, she's written at least 3 brilliant books, and I was kind of nervous about going there. But when I got there, I couldn't have been made more welcome because Sarah actually baked me a pie. I got this. She listened to my book the night before, my previous book. She listened to it on audiobook and knew that I love vultures, and so baked me a vulture pie. There were no vultures in the pie. It was a chicken pie. It was delicious, but she put vultures on the top because she knew I loved vultures, which was incredibly sweet. And she has been incredibly welcoming and a great mentor throughout the whole of this project. And what was even more amazing than her pie were her house guests, because she had staying with her at the time Mary Jane West Eberhard and Jean Altman. And together, these women have redefined what it means to be female. They have fought the scientific patriarchy with fierce data and logic, and between them, they have, science owes them, we owe them a huge amount. And it was extraordinary to get to meet them. I like to think of them as the rabble-rousing matriarchs of modern Darwinism. And you'll meet some of their work I'll talk about some of their work over the next hour. And this is the 4th member of the crew. This is Patricia Goarty. And these women call themselves feminist Darwinists. So they're not saying that Darwin was all wrong by any means. It's just that he was looking at the world through a Victorian pinhole camera. And thanks to their work and the scientists that they've inspired, we're now getting the full Technicolor version of life. And it's so much richer and more interesting for it. But of course, tearing down paradigms doesn't come easy, and often requires a fight. And Patty in particular has, despite how sweet she looks and sounds, she's had to do quite a lot of fighting. So a good example is one of her early studies, which was on songbirds. So songbirds we think of as being the sort of very paragon of monogamy. You see the male songbird and he sings his heart out and attracts a female, and then together they'll build a nest and raise the chicks together. But Patty was like, I wonder whether it's all so sweet at home as it really seems. So what she did was something totally ingenious, which was that she co-opted technology that had been developed for forensics, DNA fingerprinting, and was the first person to use that to paternity test eggs. So she took a clutch of eggs and she checked to see whether they all had the same father. And they didn't. So her subject was the eastern bluebird, which is of course famous from Zippity-Doo-Dah and Disney films, and is about as all-American as apple pie. And Patty was basically calling her a Jezebel, which was never going to go down well. But she was shocked at how much resistance there was by the ornithological establishment to her data. And when she presented at an ornithological conference in the early 1980s with her data on the paternity, there was just outrage, and she was told by a very famous male ornithologist that the only way that this could be possible was if the females had been raped. That's just, that's the only answer for this. And she's like, well, she's got this fantastic southern accent, which I won't attempt to do, but she's like, well, it's just ridiculous because Songbirds about the only thing that don't need a Me Too movement, because it's impossible. It's impossible for them to be raped, So basically, birds, if you don't know, songbirds, they have a cloaca. The male doesn't have a penis. In order to mate with the female, to fertilize her, he's got to balance on her back, and they've got to line up their cloacas, and they've got to be averted, and so if the female's not into it at any stage, she can just fly off, So the idea that she was being sexually coerced was completely ludicrous, but yet that was the line that was taken. And it actually took other scientists, like Bridget Stutchbury was one, putting radio trackers on birds, on female birds, and tracking their movements and finding that they were actively leaving their territory and soliciting sex with other males in order to establish that the females had agency in this, and they weren't being victims. And we now know that there's a huge difference between social and sexual monogamy. And songbirds do social monogamy very well, sexual monogamy less so. In fact, there are only 7% of species of birds that are actually monogamous, and that figure may even be lower by now. Even swans are unfaithful. But this discovery sparked what was being called a polyandry revolution, and we now understand that animals as diverse as lions and lizards and lobsters, the females all have a strategy of mating with multiple males. And to Patricia Goati, it's really obvious why. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. If you mate with multiple males, you have more chance of finding genetic compatibility. And basically, mating with multiple males means healthier offspring at the end of the day. So females are just as sexually strategic as males, but what about another one of those myths, which is that males are the aggressive ones, and they're the competitive, aggressive, and females are passive and are not aggressive and not competitive. Well, females were branded basically by Darwin as having a maternal instinct, and it was thought that females were good mothers, but as such, we had a natural maternal instinct, and so we were all basically the same, and we had no competitive edge. Well, that's also not true, and I'd like to introduce you tonight to the most murderous animal in the animal kingdom. Most murderous mammal, so the mammal that's most likely to kill a member of its own species, and this is it. It's not me. It's the meerkat. So you're probably familiar with the meerkat from cute TV shows. They're incredibly cute and funny creatures, but the fact of the matter is that every meerkat has a 1 in 5 chance of being killed by another meerkat. Most probably its own mother or sister. Meerkat society is tense and homicidal. And it's predicated on ruthless competition between females who will readily kill and eat each other's pups. And this is kept in check by a dominant female who's the dominant member of the community. Meerkats live in extended family groups, and the dominant, she basically, any female that dares to get pregnant by a roving male is basically she'll kill their babies and evict them from the clan. And obviously in the Kalahari desert, eviction is tantamount to a death sentence. But the females are allowed back on the condition that they will wet nurse their murderous their murderers' babies themselves, and that enables the dominant female to put all of her energy into making more pups and not have to spend energy on lactation herself. So, that's it's pretty brutal, and that's how the meerkat has become the most murderous mammal on the planet. It was actually a survey of 1,000 mammals that found that the meerkat was the most murderous. Even more so than humans. So, and it's the females that are the most aggressive. It's not exactly meerkat manner, and it has always surprised me that meerkats have become such sort of cosy, cute TV fodder when their society is so brutal. And really kind of, they are described scientifically as being cooperative, which has also struck me as somewhat ironic because it doesn't seem much like cooperation to me. It's more like reproductive despotism. But it's definitely very competitive and aggressive. Now, of course, the queens of the cooperative lifestyle are the social insects. And here you can see a termite queen. And her gargantuan distended abdomen. So these have really taken this idea of cooperation to the max. So you can just make out the head of the queen and her thorax and her legs, but her entire abdomen has swelled in order to just lay eggs, basically. So she can lay over 20,000 eggs a day and is capable of producing, in theory, 146 million termites in her lifetime, which is because they can live for 20 years and they lay an egg every couple of seconds. But in order to do that, that's all she can do. So she's serviced by an army of helpers who will feed her and clean her and look after the babies. But she is the most reproductively successful animal on the planet. And in order to achieve this, her abdomen swells over 1,000 times, allowing her to spend all of that energy on laying eggs. And this extreme brand of cooperative breeding, involving a clear division of labour between the queen and the workers, is known as eusociality. And it may seem comforting to think that just happens in insects. There's nothing like that in mammals. We've got nothing so sort of crazy sci-fi going on amongst mammals, but we do, actually, it turns out. There is a eusocial mammal out there, and this is it. It's the naked mole rat. I happen to think that naked mole rats are incredibly cute, but I may be alone in thinking that. But they are fantastically weird animals. They regularly top the ugly animal charts, and you can sort of see why. Chris Fawkes, who's been studying them for 20 years in London, he says they look like a penis with teeth, which is, It's a graphic description, but you know, you can sort of see what he's getting at. But they're fantastically weird animals, and I love strange, weird animals, and I've wanted to see them all my life. And they live underground in vast underground networks in very hostile places in Kenya and East Africa, under sort of baked earth. So incredibly hard to see because they don't pop up very often because they get burnt to a crisp, clearly. So, but the first time I met them wasn't in East Africa. It was in an incredibly hot cupboard in East London, where Chris Fawkes has been studying them, and he's created a facsimile of their underground world in this cupboard using a load of Tupperware and plastic tubing. And it's a fantastically Heath Robinson affair, but it does mean that he's able to observe their extraordinary lifestyle. So they live in colonies up to 300, and there's one queen who's the only breeding female, and she has one or two mates. And outside of those breeding individuals, the queen and her mates, none of the other members of the colony will breed because they can't, because they haven't gone through puberty. So she actually suppresses their reproduction. And they don't go through puberty. And Chris has been trying to work out why and how that is. And he thinks that the way that she achieves it is by basically being a royal bully. Now you can see them in motion because they are extraordinary creatures. So there you go, dominance behavior. That clambering over the top, that's the queen exerting her dominance. Oh, look how she's exerting her dominance. She's like, yeah, I'm the queen. So she basically goes around physically stating her dominance by clambering over individuals, shoving them, biting them. I mean, it suddenly all makes the British royal family seem remarkably benign. But that's what happens to the naked mole rat queen. She basically spends her life. She's not like the termite who lives in a royal chamber and is sort of endlessly groomed and cared for. She's just goes around bullying the whole time. And what Chris thinks is that upsets the hormones, and in particular prolactin, and means that they never go through sexual maturity. All the while, she's dominant and on the move and on her big royal bullying tour. Once she stops, if she becomes weak, then Chris told me all hell breaks loose. And he goes, it's very Game of Thrones really quick. Because a bunch of females will suddenly mature and then they will fight to the death for the queen's spot. Because there's everything to fight for in that moment. There's no point. I mean, the point of life is to reproduce, and they have this one opportunity. And he said that, you know, he's like, it's a gnawing teeth of death, and you know that the tubes get filled with blood until a female becomes the winner. And she's everything to play for, because, you know, the queen is able to have litters of 27 pups at a time. I mean, this is an extraordinary feat for a mammal. She doesn't even have that many nipples, you know, so she can have 27 pups at a time. And one female was documented having 900 pups in 24 years, you know, which is an extraordinary output for a female. And it sort of really shows that, you know, we think of, you know, like those male elephant seals that we saw earlier, you know, that were fighting. And, you know, the idea is that males, you know, are much more variable and much more varied in their reproductive success, because you'll have one male that would, you know, have a bunch of females that he'll command, and the other males won't breed. And so this difference in reproductive success drives evolution, right? And the idea was that females didn't have that kind of difference, you know. Well, you know, take a red stag, for example. They're really famous for, you know, the males have got these huge horns, and in the rut they'll fight each other. Tim Clutton-Brock told me that the most successful red stag that he's ever documented only ever managed to sire 25 offspring in his lifetime for all of that fighting. And here you have the naked mole rat queen, and she's doing 900. So, you know, the idea that females are less variable than males is simply not true. Now, the females can live for, as I say, for 20 odd years. And you probably think to yourself, well, that's quite a long time for an animal that size. You know, they're about the size of a hamster. It should really only live about 3 years. And this is the extra added topping on this dystopia, is that the queen is apparently immune to aging. It's just extraordinary. So they're studied in Silicon Valley labs because they hold the secret to eternal youth. They can live 9 times longer than is expected of a mammal their size. Their DNA doesn't age like normal mammals. They're immune to cancer. And they're when you touch them, I mean, they're really soft. You wouldn't expect it, but it's because their skin is full of hyaluron, which is this the interstitial gloop that's in super expensive face creams. You know, so that is the face of eternal youth. It's not pretty, but there it is. So you'll be pleased to hear that female authority isn't always so brutal. These are, here's a pod of orcas, and orcas similarly live in family groups, hugely social, highly intelligent. They're basically souped up dolphins. They're the biggest member of the cetacean family. And for a long time, it was thought that it was the males that were in charge. Of course, they're bigger, and the females were just the harem. But it turns out that it's not only the females that are in charge, it's actually the postmenopausal grannies that are in charge. And the research that has revealed this happened just up the coast just off the coast of Washington State. A group of orcas known as the Southern Residents have told us all about this. And it's fascinating because menopause is actually incredibly rare in the animal kingdom. So, you know, natural selection takes a pretty dim view of a loss of fertility. You know, the point of life is to reproduce. Once you stop reproducing, you die. You know, and even famously long-lived animals like Galapagos tortoises or even elephants will continue reproducing into their twilight years, which is particularly astonishing when you think of an elephant, you know, has a pregnancy of 22 months and she's still going through that ordeal in her 60s. But that is the case, right? I mean, it's amazing. So orcas are something of an anomaly, but it was amazing to discover that the orcas also do this, because humans had been thought of as being this sort of menopausal freaks, basically, for living beyond our reproductive fitness. But we now know we're not alone. It's not just orcas. There are actually 4 species of toothed whale that also go through the menopause. And what we now understand is that from studying the orcas, so the Southern Residents have been studied for 40 or 50 years, and there's a huge amount of data on their society. And what was discovered is actually it's these postmenopausal females that are leading their community, and basically by stopping reproducing halfway through their life, they stop competing with their daughters, and by investing instead in their existing offspring, their genetic legacy does much better in the end. So it supports what was proposed many years ago by Kristen Hawkes as the grandmother hypothesis as to why we also go through menopause. And they're basically, these old lady whales are the repositories for ecological wisdom that keep their hunting community alive. And you might be thinking to yourself, how do you study menopause in an orca? You know, like, how are you going to do hormone samples? Like, how do you know all this stuff? Well, because you can't take blood samples, right? You can't. It's a 6-ton swimming torpedo with teeth. You're not going to do daily blood samples. No, instead what you do is you get fecal samples. So here I am modelling some orca poop, actually, in a Tupperware box. This was when I went... So I joined Dr. Giles, who is the Southern Residents' official pooper scooper, basically. She plies her trade off the San Juan Islands, off the coast of Seattle. And I arrived and at her boat, and she handed me a net, and I was like, oh my God. And she said, don't worry, whales do floaters, big ones. But I was thinking, but, still we've got to find those things, but actually they've got help in the shape of Eber. This is Dr. Giles here with Eber, who's a rescue dog. It was a street dog from Sacramento who's been rehomed and trained to sniff out orca poop. And she can sniff orca poop from a nautical mile away. This is Eber in her office. And she takes her job very seriously. And so, yeah, she guided us towards some orca poop that day, and poop is a gold mine. It can tell you all about the hormones obviously involved, and all sorts about the health of the sea, the Salish Sea. And I was really, I discovered that these orcas are an extraordinary society that's incredibly inclusive and caring and empathetic, and They have these extraordinary brains. They have a brain that weighs 7 kilos, and it has more surface area for cognitive thought than any other animal on the planet. And they really are a magnet for superlatives intellectually, because they also have this extra paralimbic lobe that's only found in dolphins and orcas, and where it's positioned in the brain suggests that they process emotion in a way that we actually can't comprehend. So they are these extraordinary, socially cohesive, empathetic, intelligent creatures, and they care for one another. These wise old lady whales are caring for their society. And this individual here on the right has scoliosis, and it wasn't able to sort of hunt as efficiently as the rest of the clan, but it was supported, and food would be shared with it. So I have to say I found the story of these empathetic, wise old lady killer whales incredibly moving and inspiring. But what about primates? Well, we're taught that, we're led to believe that patriarchy is burnt into our DNA. In the 1970s, this is what Lionel Tiger had to say about female primates seem biologically unprogrammed to dominate political systems. Female primates are just mothers, just getting on with being a mother, and there was no need to be political or compete with one another. Well, this is a completely ludicrous idea, and thanks to the work of Jean Altman, amongst many others, who you saw in the photo earlier with Sarah. Jean established a long-running baboon study that's been going for about 40 years now, and has really amassed a huge amount of data on mothers and how they behave. And we now understand that in all primate societies, females, the males may well be having their showy fight for dominance, but females also inhabit a hierarchy. And in many cases, like baboons, it's actually a very stable hierarchy. The male dominant, the alpha male, will come and go in a fist fight, but the females don't disperse. So their matrilines, their status is inherited down the line, and they form the sort of stable core of the group, and they're very politically savvy. They are very, very conscious of status, and with good reason, because where you are in that hierarchy has a huge bearing on how successful you'll be as a mother, and how many babies that you'll successfully raise. And certainly with baboons, Jean Altman's work has established that in order to sort of escape the shackles of being born into lower class, if you play a deft political game and make strategic friendships with male and female baboons, then you're able to do much better in your lot in life. So the idea that females aren't political or is completely ludicrous. But yet, nevertheless, it seems natural, doesn't it, that males would be in charge. That's what feels natural to us. And that's why you get characters like this. So for those of you that have seen the movie Madagascar, you'll recognise this is King Julian. He's a ring-tailed lemur, and lemurs are primates. And I actually went to Madagascar myself, and King Julian was nowhere to be found, because it turns out the ring-tailed lemurs are female dominant. So these are some female ringtails that I filmed doing their favourite thing in the morning, which is sunbathing. So basically. Female ringtails, it's kind of cold sleeping in caves, and so they like to start the morning with soaking up some sun. But God forbid any male should take one of the prime sunbathing spots, and they'll whack them over the head. If they try and eat before them, they'll whack them over the head. The females rule with an iron fist, and not only that, they also do a lot of the scent marking and territorial work that's normally associated with males, like with chimpanzees, for example. So, the males are afraid of them, basically, and they're kept in line by the females. But it's not just ringtail lemurs that are female dominant. These are a selection of the lemurs that I met when I was in Madagascar, and they were all female dominant species. In fact, there's 111 species of lemur, and 90% of them are female dominant. And the reason why this is interesting is because lemurs are amongst our most ancestral primate cousins. So they broke off from the main primate line about sort of 50 million years ago, and have been evolving in isolation in Madagascar since. But along with the bush babies and galagas, the other prosimians, which are also female dominant, it suggests that the ancestor of all primates was female dominant. So, and you can they don't look much like primates, but you can really see it when you look at their hands. It was the hand of a rough-tailed black and white rough lemur, and you can see that they are sort of they look more like primates when you can see their hands. But of course, this is what we're more familiar with, isn't it? These are chimpanzee males, and they're all revved up for a fight, and they've got their furs standing on end, and they're baring their canines, and this has long been a model for human ancestry. The chimpanzee, patriarchal and warlike, and males are bigger than females. They have these big canines, and they're aggressively dominant. But are they really the best model for hominid society, for our ancestry? Well, perhaps not, because we have another equally close relative, which is the bonobo. And this sassy character I met in San Diego Zoo. This is Loretta. And she's the boss of her community. So bonobos are pygmy chimpanzees. They have exactly the equal amount. We're equally closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos. And the reason why Loretta is, Amy Parish, who's studied Loretta for over 20 years, says she looks a bit like Shrek, which is, is perhaps a little unfair, but she's really bald because of all the grooming she gets. So the balder you are is a sign of status, so she's been groomed so much, she's lost most of her hair because she's the boss. She's the boss in at San Diego Zoo, the community they have there. And similarly in the wild, bonobos are more often than not female dominant. Sometimes you might have a situation where there's a co-dominance but basically females are dominant generally over males. But they're smaller than males. But they achieve their dominance by forming a very strong, powerful sisterhood that stands up to male aggression. And this is interesting because unlike the baboons that we saw earlier, the females actually disperse. So the females, when they join a group, they're not related to the other individuals. So they're naturally competitive. But the way that they overcome that competition is by having sex with one another. So the females, they have sexual relationships with each other, and this dampens the aggression and means that they all get along with each other. So basically, females have overthrown the patriarchy through ecstatic same-sex frottage. So go sisters. Do you know what I mean? Like it's an astonishing story, and they're known as the make love not war hippie ape, and they're just not as aggressive as chimpanzees. And it's not just the females that are having sex with each other. The males will have sex with each other, and obviously males and females do as well. So and they have a very peaceful society. And their society could equally be a model for for our ancestry. There's, and anthropologists will argue forever about whether our ancestors were more chimp-like or more bonobo-like, and they will continue to have those arguments. But I think what's fascinating really is to see how flexible dominance is, and the power of the sisterhood. And also how flexible sexuality is, because Amy Parish and Frans de Waal, who studied bonobos for many, many years, say that all bonobos are fundamentally bisexual. That's their sexual orientation. And that brings me on to the sort of newest form of bias, really, that I came across. Beyond the sort of sexist bias that was outlined by Victorian stereotypes that are being overthrown, is this heteronormative bias, where we just sort of assume that couples are male and female, and that's the way that it works. Well, not always. So this photograph I took in Hawaii, this is a Laysan albatross, and this particular colony in Hawaii have been studied for 50 years. And Laysan albatross, like many albatross, they're serial monogamists. And, they'll spend 6 months on the wing, and then they'll connect with their partner with a huge, flamboyant and frankly hilarious dance that they do, where they kind of moo in the air and clap, 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 and then it's just absolutely wonderful thing to see. But they have to partner up, because raising a chick takes 6 months. You can't do it by yourself, and the females lay one egg at a time. But this particular colony, over the course of the 40 or so years that they've been collecting data on it, they found this phenomenon of double clutches, where there were some nests that had 2 eggs in them. It's impossible for a female to lay 2 eggs. It's just not possible. So there were all sorts of kind of crazy ideas of why the females were laying 2 eggs. And then Lindsay Young, who's in the back of that shot there, and her colleague thought to themselves, well, are we sure that they're male and female couples? They look identical. Everybody assumed they were male and female couples. And she went round and she did, of the 50-odd nests that there were in the colony, she went and did DNA. She got feathers and did DNA, and found, much to her shock, that a third of the couples in the colony were female-female couples. And that's why they were 2 eggs, because basically the females, this is a new colony. The big colony is on this sort of atoll way out, and there's thousands and thousands of birds. And so these are sort of pioneers, the birds that are striking out in the North Shore of Oahu. And what happens is it's more likely to be the females that are the pioneers. The males tend to stay and nest where they were born. And so there's a shortage of males in this colony, and the females are making the best of the situation by basically using other albatross husbands as sperm donors and then shacking up with a female in order to raise the chicks, which is a really sensible idea. And some of these females will, and so they both will lay an egg, and then only one can be cared for, and so generally one rolls out, and only one gets raised. And that's quite random with that process. It doesn't seem like they're not really very smart and territorial about their eggs. In fact, Lindsay said to me that she's even seen them trying to incubate volleyballs. So there's a lot of discernment that goes on over eggs. So she doesn't think that they're strategically like booting out the other ones. That it's just a sort of random thing. Only one ends up being raised. But some of these couples, some of the females, might pair with a female one year, and then they might mate with a male the next year and couple up and be with that male. But some of these female couples have been together for a long time because they just work. And there was one couple that I met who had been together for 17 years, since Lindsay has been taking data, 17 years. And in that time, they've had 8 chicks and 3 grandchicks. And she said that they do all the same stuff, when they go off for 6 months on the wing, and then when they're reunited, they do all the same lovey-dovey dances and, preening and all the same sort of bird kissing that releases bird oxytocin and strengthens that pair bond. And they've just got it right. It just works. So I think what's really fantastic about this story is it just shows how flexible sexual behavior and sexuality really is in the animal kingdom. And I think that's one of the things that really surprised me as I was doing this research that I didn't expect to find was the plasticity of sex and sex and sexuality. So here's another example. We talked earlier, I mentioned about the maternal instinct. The females are thought to be sort of, born with this mythical maternal instinct. Well, if you're a frog, it's more likely than not that it's the males that do the parental care, not the females. The females might just, literally just lay their eggs and then hop off. They're done with it, And then the male is left, making sure that the eggs are, don't get eaten by other predators and that they stay nice and wet. And in some cases, giving them piggybacks on their back to take them to little ponds high up in trees. And they're a candidate for nature's best dad, But and this is a poison dart frog, Phyllobates terribilis, actually. But these frogs, sometimes. And it's completely random. Sometimes it's more often than not it's the male, but sometimes it is the female that does it. And so Lauren O'Connell, who's a brilliant neuroscientist at Stanford, she thought to herself, well, that's a really interesting way for us to look at the sort of the neurological mechanics of maternal instinct, of this parental instinct. And she found that the neural architecture in the brain that triggers this behavior is basically exactly the same in males and females. It's these galanin neurons that get activated, and they trigger this parental behavior. So it's a parental instinct. And then sure enough, Catherine Dulac, who's at Harvard a few years later, and she won a huge science prize a couple of years ago for finding exactly the same thing in the brains of mice. So she found that she was able to, that it was galanin neurons, it was the same neural architecture, just, a bit more advanced, but in mice, that she could trigger parental behavior, nurturing behavior in males, which are normally infanticidal, or virgin females are also infanticidal, but by stimulating this area. She calls it a switch for parenting, basically. Same in males and females. And she's pretty convinced that you'll find it in humans, that, there's no reason why we shouldn't. So, for a long time, we've had this idea that male brains are from Mars and females are from Venus. And, we these massive differences in our brains. Darwin himself thought that males were more evolved and that they were more intelligent. We've been looking for years for significant differences in the brains of males and females, and we just can't find them. There are some differences that are related to reproduction, but beyond that, they are more or less the same. And nowhere is this more evident than in species that actually change sex. So these are a clown or an anemone fish, and they're one of the 500 species of fish that we know of that regularly switch sex. Some species do it several times a day, but the anemone fish just does it once in a lifetime. And they're probably the most famous because they're the stars of Finding Nemo, right? We all know the anemone fish. And what happens with anemone fish is that they live in an anemone, and the female and male, they form a monogamous partnership. And there's not a lot of room in an anemone, so you have a male and a female. The female's dominant; she's much bigger, and then a couple of immature males. And if you remove the female, if she gets eaten or she dies, then her male partner, will transition and become the dominant female. And one of the immature males will go through sexual maturity and become her breeding partner. Which, of course, means that a biologically accurate version of Finding Nemo, in which little Nemo lost his mum and went on a big adventure and was reunited with his dad at the end of the movie, would have a very different ending. But what's fascinating about these fish, for Justin Rhodes, who studies them, is that he's able to sort of study that transition and how that happens, the mechanics of that. And what he's found is that almost immediately, if you remove the female, the male that's left behind will start behaving like a female and will be recognized as a female. And you know that because the females are incredibly aggressive. And if you put two females together, he showed this to me. He sent me a video. I couldn't believe it. But he's like, yeah, check them out. They yell at each other, right? And it's true. They make this kind of pop, pop, pop sound. And they're like really aggressive with each other. And then if you put a male and a female together, then the female's not aggressive. And two males are not aggressive with each other. So he knows that, that almost immediately the females are, the male, as soon as the female's taken out, starts behaving as a female, is recognized as a female by the other fish. But the gonads take up to a year to change from being testes to ovaries. So the biological sex remains male for a long time, whereas the behavior and the sexual identity of the fish, as it were. I mean, in animals, we don't talk about gender. Animals don't have gender as far as science is concerned. We consider that to be a social and cultural psychological construct, but in many ways you could think of this as being like the gender of the fish is female, but the sex is male for some time, which is really fascinating, I think, and suggests that sex is incredibly complicated, and perhaps sexual identity, sexual behavior, sexuality, and biological sex are independently regulated. It's definitely it's a complex situation.
So do we have any questions here? Does anybody have one? I have a couple online, but we'll go right here.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi there.
I know that you have done for many years a lot of research in the field, and I'm wondering, has it changed in the last couple of years with what everyone's going through with COVID, or is the great outdoors the perfect place to be doing your work?
Well, I did study science at university, but I'm a storyteller now. So I do visit a lot of scientists in the field, and there was a field science like everything else just stopped when COVID hit, because you couldn't travel, people couldn't get, and it was a really scary time for field science because, how are you going to get to your study? How are you going to maintain study sites? Projects like, Gene Altman's that have been running for 40 years, you've got to maintain those. But things are up and running again now, and field life is continuing, thank goodness. So, but yeah, like everybody, field scientists have had to adjust and cope. But I went out with, what's interesting though is that one has to be aware that COVID can spread not just between humans, but from humans to animals as well. So we went, it was an amazing privilege on our Commonwealth safari. We went to go and see the gorillas in Rwanda. And, we wore masks obviously the whole time because, we didn't want, the gorillas could very easily catch COVID from us, and we don't want that. And I was with some capuchin researchers in Costa Rica at the end of last year, running around the bush chasing capuchins, which is a very sweaty business, and made 10 times worse by wearing a mask. But you've got to do it, because God forbid you were to pass it on to another primate, if the devastation that it's wreaked amongst human society. So, yeah, it's been challenging times, but I think things are getting back to normal again, thankfully. Good question.
Thank you. First off, I apologize for us being late. We missed much of the meat of your presentation, so we're sorry about that. But the two animals that you showed, the frog and the mouse, and you were talking about how it's been demonstrated the neural architecture is the same and all. And so I'm wondering about their instinct or impulse to parenthood. If that's the case, why is it hormonal likely that triggers?
That's the million-dollar question. That's a fantastic question. And that was the first question that I asked Catherine Dulac. I was like, so what's the trigger? And she was like, I'm working on it. So she thinks that it's likely to be a complex mixture of internal and external cues. But it's not as simple as it just being oxytocin. So I was like, oh, is it just oxytocin that just does it? I mean, oxytocin is a cuddle hormone. We all know. You're probably all familiar with it's an incredibly powerful bonding hormone and is associated with motherhood as well. But the oxytocin system is parallel. This system works is triggered by something else, basically.
I would think there's a behavioral feedback loop too. Exactly.
Yeah. But she's working on that, and soon we'll know. But the good news is, and she says, and it was really sweet. She said, it's fantastic because, it gets this. It's a switch that does get triggered, and it can get triggered equally in males and females, and also in adoptive parents. So, and I think that's a really profound and wonderful thing for people to understand that, you're not like born with this instinct, but it lives in all of us. It just has to be triggered, basically.
So I have a question from an online viewer, which is there some place in the world that you still hope to travel to, and any animal that you really want to observe in their natural habitat?
Well, I would have said gorillas, but we clambered up a mountain and saw those earlier in the year. It would be the bonobos, actually, because I haven't been to the Congo and I haven't seen the bonobos, and I just think they're just so incredibly fascinating, and there's not very many of them. They only exist on one side of the Congo River, unlike the chimpanzees that are quite widely distributed. So, and they're really, where they exist is just like a hotbed of war and strife, and I just would really love to see them. I'm a bit nervous of going there, but I just would really, really love to go and see them. So I think the bonobos would be the top of my list.
And then is there, what was the most surprising animal that you discovered when you were doing this book?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because the most surprising animal is an incredibly common animal, actually, that really blew my mind the most, and that's the common garden mole. So, I mean, any of you are gardeners, you probably hate moles. They ruin your garden with their, rude molehills. But they're extraordinary creatures, right? So living underground's not easy, and there's, you got to dig for a living, and there's not a lot of oxygen down there. And so evolution's given the mole a number of amazing adaptations. They've got, they can smell in stereo, so they can find their worm prey in the pitch black. They've got an extra thumb, so they can dig harder. And they've got specialized blood cells, which means they can process waste gases more efficiently. But the most amazing thing about the female mole are her bulging male gonads. So the female mole has what's described as ovotestes. So her gonads are half ovarian tissue and half testicular tissue. And during the short breeding season, the ovarian tissue pumps out eggs, and she mates and is pregnant and gives birth as you'd expect. But outside of the breeding season, the testicular tissue swells and pumps out testosterone, which makes her dig really hard and be really aggressive and defend her pups. And this sort of gonadal fluidity was something that we didn't really think was possible in mammals, because how we think about sort of sexual differentiation and determination, you think of it as being, in terms of genetics, we all learn at school, don't we? That there's females are XX and males are XY. And you sort of think that all the genes for making a male are going to be on the Y chromosome, and the genes for making a female will be on the X chromosome, and it's all nice and neat and ordered. Well, it's nothing like that. So Jenny Graves, who's been studying sexual determination in everything from platypus to nematode worms. She's Australian, now in her 80s. Amazing woman. She was part of the team that found the SRY gene, which is the trigger for these pathways in humans. So in humans, if there's an SRY gene, if there's a Y chromosome, an SRY gene on the Y chromosome, then it triggers the pathway to being male. And in the absence of it, the pathway is the female pathway. And Jenny explained to me that we'd always thought of these pathways as being linear and distinct, but it turns out that they're not. They're enmeshed, and they work antagonistically. So the pathway to create a male, which is basically to create testes, also suppresses making an ovary. So, and the most amazing thing is that the genes involved in these two pathways to make a testes or to make an ovary, other than the SRY gene, which is the trigger, they're the same genes. Like, they're the same genes, they just play in a different order to a different tune. And when she explained to me what these pathways look like, she sent me this extraordinary mechanical machine thing with cogs and whirs and balls getting crushed and spat out, and it's chaos, right? But that's because evolution is a series of botch jobs, and we think of it as this sort of quest for perfection, but it's not. It's just a series of botch jobs, right? And so this system, is very sort of unstable, and the slightest change in it means that you can have creatures like the mole. So the mole achieves her extraordinary ovotestes. She's only got a mutation in two of the proteins that regulate two genes that regulate the process, right? So, and that's how that's achieved. So, you might look at this sort of this anarchy of sex determination and think, "Wow, God, evolution, what were you thinking? Like, how?" But it's actually it throws up all this variation. And that's brilliant, because that's what we need to evolve, And I think as humans, we're sort of struggling with this idea of variation and what it means. And I think when you look at the animal kingdom and you see the point of variation, then you understand that it's all normal and it's all necessary. And without it, we would cease to evolve. So it's part of the system. It's all good, basically. So that blew my mind, and that made me really realize that, that basically males and females, as I said, we're more alike than we are different, and we're made of the same genes, essentially, the same bodies, the same brains. We should just maybe, Darwin made us focus on the differences between the sexes, and maybe if we focused on the similarities, then we'd all get along with each other a bit better. So here they are, some of the females from my book that I've introduced you to, and they teach us that sex is no crystal ball, really. It's neither static nor deterministic. It's a flexible trait, just like any other, that's shaped by the peculiar interaction of genes in the environment. And the time has come to sort of ditch these outdated binary expectations of the sexes, I think, and to think of them as being set in one or the other, because actually males and females are more alike than they are different. And the female experience exists on a continuum. It's variable, highly plastic, and refuses to conform to archaic classifications. And I think our appreciation of this fact can only enrich our understanding of the natural world and enhance our empathy for one another as humans. Thank you.